Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. We've been studying the canons, and I want to continue with that. There's not a whole lot left, so I wanted to go through the Dead Sea Scroll part of that tonight. So, if we take a look at what we have been studying, we'll just go to the site here. We've looked at the Old Testament, New Testament, Apocrypha, and then last week, or a week before last, actually, we looked at Orthodox editions. So, pulling all this together, just real briefly, we looked at the Old Testament and saw that we have the 39 books of the Old Testament. The New Testament was, or the Old Testament rather, was started by Moses and ended by Ezra. So we have Genesis to Malachi. And the concept is that the books were put together by the prophets. So they're supposed to be exactly what they're supposed to be. And we have several extra biblical sources to show that that's why, and the reason why the King James 1611 was created the way it was. And then we looked at the New Testament and saw the same thing, 27 books in the New Testament. We looked at the prophecy from the Dead Sea Scrolls of a creation of a canon. We looked at what the early church fathers said it was supposed to be, and it turns out to be exactly that. So, our concept then is that 39 books of the Old Testament, 27 books of the New, come together to form our Bibles. Now, there were writings before the Old Testament, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then after the New Testament. Secular writings, historical writings, and then prophets also. And we've seen that kind of thing. That doesn't mean we add it to the canon. So it's really, really important. And we don't call what was before the Old Testament or what was between the Old and New Testament and what's after the New Testament canons themselves. They're just collections of books. So the canons are what we want to judge everything by, the Old and the New Testament. So we saw this here. We have all the charts and what the Dead Sea Scrolls and church fathers all talked about. Then we looked at the Apocrypha, and basically there's the apocryphal books, Roman Catholic apocryphal books, and the one Anglican apocryphal book that was placed in the center. And we studied all these for that. Then we went to the Orthodox editions, and we saw that Orthodox is basically Roman Catholic, and there's lots of Orthodox churches. There should be theoretically one for every country that's out there. Uh, but there are 9 in particular that have extra books in their canon. They just kind of stashed them in there for whatever reason. And we went through and looked at these last time. And so we made a list of the other books here and then talked about them in general. So most of these I have not looked at, especially the ones from most of the ones from the Ethiopian canon. I haven't seen in English. I'm not sure they are in English yet, but those will be interesting to look at. And then last week we went to biblically endorsed books, and basically we just went down the list. These are books that are mentioned in the Bible, and by Bible we mean the Old and the New Testament. So if it says, for instance, if you can get a hold of it, you might want to read Gad the seer, Nathan the prophet, Ahijah the Shilonite, Shemaiah the prophet, and the visions of the prophet Iddo. Should be interesting prophecies. We're told in the Bible that Solomon wrote over 3,000 proverbs, which is a lot more than what we have in our books of Proverbs. 1,005 songs. There's the sayings of the seers, and we went down the list like that. And we talked about some of these things are actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then some of these Old Testament things might just be other titles for King's Chronicles. We don't know for sure. And the Book of Jasher is another one. Anything in here that's in red, you could click on it, and we've done a translation of it. Okay. And that's where we ended last week. So this week, we're going to go to Dead Sea Scroll endorsed books. And we might change the title on that. But basically, what we want to do is look and see in the Dead Sea Scrolls what collection of books we had. And then in those, what did they mention? Well, we have the entire Old Testament. So if we go back for a moment to the biblically endorsed books, all of these are in the Old Testament mentioned. So they're also mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Old Testament part. No New Testament writings, so just the Old Testament books. So the first part in here, and this is interesting, we will be adding to this as we go by. But let me just tell you the legend of the patriarchs. So according to the scrolls, Pharisees, Sadducees, basically Talmud, pretty much everybody, church fathers, there was a writing put together called the Writings of the Fathers, and we see this in many places in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it's the testaments, and the idea is that when you get toward your end of life, you write a last will and testament. Now, in America, when I say I've written a last will and testament, it's pretty much just to say when I'm dead, who gets my stuff or how I want things done. And their concept's a little different. This is something I want to pass down to my children. So I want to tell them the mistakes I made. Don't mess with fornication, don't mess with alcohol. Make sure you pay off your debts quickly because I did or didn't, and this is what happened to me. Make sure to remember the prophecies, Messiah, and these things. So they're really interesting. So supposedly, from Adam to Aaron are testaments. Some 40 or more testaments are written. And they're just moral lessons that you want to give your kids. Plus, a type of moral lesson is what are you going to do with Messiah when he comes? What are the prophecies about the Messiah? What does he do when he comes? How does he save us? When does it happen? These kind of things. And those are all through the Testaments. So it's really interesting to look at that kind of stuff and see. So we have a list. These are the list of testaments that we do have at least a part of. So for instance, the Testament of Adam, we don't have anything of that though, except Josephus gives us a quote out of Antiquities 1, 2, 3, basically telling us that Adam had prophesied the world would be destroyed once by fire and once by a flood of water. But he didn't know which one was which and began to talk about it. We're told that Canaan understood which one was first and had other prophecies too, but there's no quotes of his. We do have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a little bit of the Testament of Enos. Again, talking about his grandfather and his sons and the Messiah. So it's really interesting. We have a piece of Lamech, a piece of Noah. Then he gets down to Abraham. Don't have anything from Isaac. Some of Jacob. And there's actually a bit in the Talmud about Jacob, about how he interpreted the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Doesn't mean exactly what modern day Judaism thinks it means, according to Jacob. I don't have that piece. And that's another thing where the Talmud will actually say he quotes it and he has a greater teaching than what we have. So really interesting. We've talked about the Testament of Noah before, about how it has some amazing prophecies in it. And we've talked about how, and we'll get back to that. We'll start studying the prophecies here soon. But in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel has a vision, or Nebuchadnezzar actually has a vision of these metal empires. There's Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Rome splits into two. And then we haven't seen it yet, but Rome fragments from those two somehow into 10 nations and they're ruling when the Messiah comes to set up the kingdom. So then there's a lot of extra information in other scrolls. But in the Testament of Noah, we're kind of going backwards. And I think this is really interesting because he sees the vision as metal empires taking over countries. Countries are trees, and metal empires are metal mountains, but it's the same metals in the same order. So very, very interesting. And I was talking to a friend of mine. I think I may have mentioned it last week, but this last week I found two other scroll fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls proper. Nobody's found anything new yet, any that I know of. but they actually make mention of the empires again. So, and more corroboration of these things. So, and then there's other prophecies in there too. So, it helps us to understand Genesis, some odd things in Genesis about Noah. So, very, very interesting. Abraham, Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob are mentioned. So, you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. And so each one of these have some amazing prophecies and amazing moral um, stories in them. The thing about this, though, when you take the Jacob's kids, these 12 testaments from Reuben to Benjamin, it's an interesting story because they are found complete in the Armenian canon. We talked about this when we talked about the Apocrypha. So the story is interesting. The story is somewhere in the Middle Ages, somebody shows up with Hebrew scrolls. That's this stuff. They said they were digging around in the Judean desert. They came across some caves that had these scrolls in them. Well, the Armenian church decides this is legit. It needs to be added to our canon, Old Testament canon. They're not supposed to, but they do. So they translate it into Greek and add it to their canon. But if you've ever read these testaments, they're very, very Christian in doctrine because the Essenes were very Christian in doctrine. It's the original religion, and what we think of as Judaism is actually a perversion from the Pharisees, which fits with New Testament theology. So anyway, but you look at this and it's too convenient though. You ask them where the Hebrew copies are, they don't remember. They translated it into Greek, put it in their canon. But there's no Hebrew copies. It sounds too Christian. It's a nice story, but there's no evidence at all. So it's dismissed. Nobody pays any attention to it, except the Armenian Church. But then in 1948, people do find what we call Dead Sea Scrolls. They are Hebrew writings in the Judean hills. So that part of the story is true. And what's interesting is out of these 12, we found 4 or 5 pieces of these things in Hebrew. And the pieces, sometimes a couple of sentences, sometimes a whole chapter, which is not much, but it's enough to see that it's the identical translate. It actually is a translation in Hebrew. So the story they told of someone finding these scrolls in Hebrew and they translate them into Greek apparently is true, and they did a good job of translating them. So very, very interesting. But in addition to this, then, if you go, Jacob, one of his sons is Levi, and Levi gets the priesthood. So Levi gets all of the copies of the writings of the fathers, which would be everybody up to him. And then he passes it down to his son, Kohath. And so that's these last 3 here. So Levi is the first Levitical priest. Then he passes all of the public canon and all the extra information from the writings of the fathers to his son Kohath. Kohath writes a testament. We have a good piece of that testament, and he transfers the ownership when he gets ready to die to his son Amram. And we have quite a bit of Amram's testament. Very interesting stories. And we should have some of these at least on in our YouTube videos. And we'll go back and try to make them more concise, make them easier, and put them up here. Anyway, so Amram then writes his testament, turns the whole thing over to Aaron. And there actually is a piece of Aaron's testament. And I mention this to you because they're all talking about basic morality. Don't make the mistakes that I made. Go ahead and do what you're supposed to do. But remember the Messiah, the prophecies about the Messiah coming, and people would reject him and those things. And what's interesting is in the testament of Aaron, he actually makes a comment that my kids will reject Messiah when he comes. But you have been warned. If you're one of the intelligent ones, you don't have to participate. You can leave. And he actually says this. He says, if you want to be in God's grace, when the Messiah comes and your brothers reject the Messiah, if you want to stay in God's grace, have nothing to do with the nails. And I'm sure there's more to it than that. That's the piece of the fragment. But for us, looking back at it, yeah, if you want to be in God's grace, you can't really do anything. It's God's will the Messiah die for our sins, but you don't have to participate. You can object, and you can have nothing to do with the crucifixion. So very, very interesting. So these all have basic theology in them. The Messiah is God incarnate. He comes to die for our sins. That reconciles us to God. There's a lot of other prophecies. Most of the prophecies in these things, which is understandably, is focused on the first coming. That's the most important thing, how we get salvation. And so it's really, really interesting. So that's, in a nutshell, the legend of the Testaments. Now we do have, I don't think I have a link here. Yeah, I'll go ahead and make a link here to it. But basically, that was one of the first things we did over these past 5 years studying the scrolls, is put together all the fragments, as far as we know of all of these testaments. But it should go from Adam to Aaron. And so it's a kind of a pre-Mosaic canon, but we probably don't want to call it that. It's just the writings of the fathers. Now, and along those lines, what's interesting is later on, the Pharisees will come up with something called Pai Gabaroth, and that is the writings of the fathers, or the sayings of the fathers. And it's got some good stuff in it, some basic logic, morality in it, but it's almost kind of a replacement of this. And I just think that's kind of interesting that they want to have a different or their own kind of patriarchal type writings. So we're not going to pay attention to this. And again, if you're taught stay away from Christians, we're a cult, that's fine. And then your rabbis tell you this is what we've always been taught, and that's basic Judaism, modern Judaism. And you're going along on that premise, and you ignore Christians, stay away from us. And then all of a sudden, the Dead Sea Scrolls are dug up, and your ancestors from way far back, much further than the rabbis, pre-first century, apparently have the concept that the Messiah is named Yeshua, or will be. He will come and die for our sins. He's actually God incarnate. And the event will occur in one Shemitah after the end of the 9th Jubilee of the 8th Luna, which on our calendar is the current modern Gregorian calendar, is 32 AD. So when you look at that, and it's like there's a guy named Yeshua that's supposed to come and die for our sins in 32 AD. He creates a synagogue of the Gentiles. There are all these writings that are going to be in a New Testament, a new canon, partially by this Benjamite guy who writes a series of epistles, among other things. If it didn't happen, then God is a liar, because it's not saying if you do what you're told, I will probably send the Messiah. There are some prophecies like that. If you're good, I'll bless you. If you're not, I will put you in captivity. It's up to you what you do. In this case, he said, no, this is for you and the Gentiles. This is my basic plan. This is what will happen. This is when it will happen. And those things were consistent. They do the same thing with Daniel. Daniel chapter 9, the Messiah comes so many days after an event. And that's ends before the destruction of the Second Temple. So somewhere before 70 AD, depending on what calendar you use and how you do it, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 AD. The Messiah is supposed to come. So, but Daniel doesn't say, if you're good, then I will send the Messiah. He says, I'm going to send the Messiah, and there's nothing you can do about it. that kind of a thing. It's a rock solid prophecy. And we know that God cannot lie. So it's really interesting to pull these together. So you should start looking at these things and then realizing somebody's not telling you the whole truth. Look at these things and then make a decision and look at what we call the New Testament, the history of what the Messiah did when he was here, and go from there. Don't go to any Christian church or anything. Just look at the scrolls, look at what your ancestors taught, and then look at the New Testament. So very, very important. So that's in a nutshell the Testament's that concept. So going further, we don't have a whole lot, but we do have others. Here are other books referenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So mentioned by name or described multiple places. So from Enoch, for instance. Now we know Enoch is one of these testaments. I don't have it listed here because it's a larger book. We've got the book of Enoch and then the book of Jubilees and other things. But theoretically, Enoch is one of these testaments, which makes me wonder about how much of these testaments are lost because we have a very small amount compared to how large the book of Enoch is. But in the book of Enoch, chapter 83, it mentions a book by Methuselah. Well, Methuselah should be in this list. Again, these are just the list of the ones that we have or that are mentioned directly. We have a piece of it from some quote. So Methuselah should be in there. Lamech should be in there, and actually it is. We do have a little piece of the testament of Lamech, and that's mentioned in Enoch 106. Book of Noah is mentioned in Jubilees 21 and Enoch 107, and Testament of Noah we have here. Probably my favorite testament as far as prophecy goes. Lots of things to study in that. So we'll have to get back to that. And then also mentioned in Jubilees 10 is Noah's herbal medicine book. And we've been trying to study herbal medicine, recalculate, refigure how they do things, backwards engineer if we can what herbs they used for what, and then go forward. And then there's in Jubilees 12 and 45, it mentions the books of the fathers. The books of the fathers would be all of these, and maybe others too, but in general, books of the fathers. And then scattered in several places through the scrolls is the book of Abraham. And again, that should be the testament of Abraham, unless there's a book and a testament, which I suppose is possible. And then you'll see down here we have the book of Amram is actually mentioned in 4Q 543 as existing. And thankfully, we have a good amount of the Testament of Amram, and that it does explain some very interesting things. And one place in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it mentions the book of Eldad and Medad. And we know from the Bible itself, the Old Testament, that they were prophesying, and somebody got mad and said, "You need to stop." Remember, and Moses said, "I wish ye all were prophets." If you had an understanding of God like that, it'd be great, So no, we're not going to stop them. And so we do actually have a piece of that. It basically just talks about a prophecy given by Eldad and Medad about Magog, something about Magog. So again, it might be one of those things that in Ezekiel 38, it mentions that my prophets of old prophesied about the Magog war. And, my thought is in the Bible, this is the first time it's mentioned. So what prophets of old did? Well, we have it in this, and we just have a real quick, brief mention that that's what it is. There's no extra information because we just have basically the title in the first sentence. So, and then from other places, the fact that the book did exist. So interesting. And of course, Gad mentions the incident also. So that's our short list, and we will be adding to this as we go. But this is a good understanding. And this is the reason mainly why I wanted to put this together. So if we have, as you can see here, the Old Testament is a canon put together by prophets, and it's closed. 39 books, no more, no less. New Testament is a canon put together by prophets, the Messiah and his disciples. 27 books, no more, no less, and it's closed. Now, we do have writings before the Old Testament, between the Old and the New Testament, and then after the New Testament. Just remember that the Pharisees said that the gifts stopped, and the Essenes said, not with us. If you're loyal to God, the gifts flow, And we would believe that as Christians because in the first century, the New Testament records the gifts continued. The early church fathers said that you had to be a believer in Messiah for the gifts to continue, whether you're Jew or Gentile. It's not just for Jews, and Jews aren't, it's not that Jews don't get it anymore either. You just have to have a relationship with the Messiah, which explains why the Essenes did and the Pharisees did not. And among Christian circles, we debate today whether we think the gifts continue or not. There's some denominations that teach that it does and some that it didn't. I, of course, am Calvary Chapel, so I believe the gifts continue. But for the purposes of our debate here, or what I'm bringing up here, is that at the very least in the first century and sometime thereafter, the gifts flowed among people who were believers in Messiah. So, with that in mind, we have actual, real prophecies given by people like Agabus in the New Testament, the daughters of Philip, and by some of the church fathers. There's actually some prophecies given that are accurate. So that's something we want to study also for our study on prophecy. But I bring that up simply to say, just because that's true, if we found some book that Agabus wrote that had real prophecy in it, we're still not going to add it to the canon. No, that's the important part. So I'm trying to get people to understand what's here, its significance, but to not dismiss it as being fake simply because it's not in the New Testament. We can't add it to the New Testament, and we can't read anything but the New Testament. There are people out there like that, and I'm trying to help people understand that. That being said, there is a lot of fake material out there. For instance, this Testament of Abraham, as an example, it's a testament supposedly written by Abraham in the Old Testament or in the Dead Sea Scrolls. No reason to assume it is not. There's no reason to assume that it is not real. But on the flip side, there is a book called the Book of Abraham, something Abraham. Anyway, it's a Book of Abraham that is in the Mormon canon. There's no reason to believe that it's real, and they're totally different books. So it's just one example. Just because someone has a Bible doesn't mean their Bible is good. It could be messed up, rewritten. Doesn't mean that we don't have a real Bible, but there are cults that make up Bibles. There are cults that make up other things. First century, you've got a lot of fake material. And we covered that in some of these lessons, like in the New Testament. Paul wrote an epistle to Laodicea. He mentions that in Colossians, so there definitely was a real one. But we're told in some of the early church documents that there were a couple of fake ones that were written by cults. The Gnostic Gospels are all written by cults. Sometimes we're told exactly who wrote them and why. And we'll get down to that eventually. We'll have Gnostic works. So we'll have that down here eventually. So this will be hopefully a complete study so we can understand what is and is not in the canon, what's supposed to be, and then go forward and look at some of these other things and kind of pull them all together. So we're not trying to add to the canon, but we are trying to obey the canon when it says there were and are other books. And you only need, honestly, the New Testament for a rule and guide of faith for life and godliness, and the Old Testament, preferably, if you can. But we have that public canon because we don't want people to think they have to read thousands and thousands of books before they can even figure out how to be saved. It's not that complicated. But for us, we want to study. We are Christians. We love the Lord. We want to study. We want to go forward. So that's our study for today. And this is out there. If you're part of our, um, you can just go to BibleFacts.org, click on the network if you want to join it. And we'll have all these different studies in here. This is just the study for the canons. So we'll look at this here. These are the ones I see, all of them. Half of them are not, don't have anything in them yet. But we have our community home. Um, Grace's Faith is my wife's blog. Conference videos, I've been putting those up. And we're going to have studies in the Church Fathers, Dead Sea Scrolls, the herbal medicine. So be good. Prophecy, and then other things like the calendar, Gad, stuff like that. We're starting with the canons of Scripture. So we'll be adding lots of stuff with this later. So at this point, let me go ahead and see what I've got here. Okay. Let's go to our chat room, and we'll see what kind of questions we might have. My wife just sent me a note on here saying that for some reason the new members are not showing up in Restream. And that could be, we had some problems before. I think I have it set to where if you were to join right now, you wouldn't be able to post in here until tomorrow. And that was to stop people. We had one guy who would post very inappropriate stuff, would get banned. He'd create a new account and start post and join and start posting again. And so that was to take care of that. So we have a new member that became an archangel. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that, but thank you. Thank you for the support. Thank you for becoming part of our network where we can talk and do things like this. So, okay, let me just go to here. First question is, let me run this over here so I can see. Where in the Talmud is Jacob's understanding of Hear, O Israel? I would have to look that up, but I remember reading a piece of it. It basically just said that that the Shema is very, very, it's like the number one saying among Jews, the concept that there's only one God and that Israel serves him. But it mentioned that Jacob had a unique understanding. And in his testament, he explained quite a bit more about it. And that's all that the Talmud said. It didn't say anything about what his understanding was or anything else. I'm thinking if he was Trinitarian, you definitely wouldn't want to do that. That's weird. It switched over real quick. That is interesting. I'm not sure how it did that. That's fine as a question. I'm not seeing that in this question. So I'll go ahead and answer that too. But anyway, where is it at? I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. But that's basically what it said. We're seeing a Trinitarian concept through most of the scrolls. Or not, maybe I shouldn't even say Trinitarian, but the concept that the Messiah is to be God incarnate. And so it's really interesting to think about that. Okay, and then going to this question, so I don't lose it. The way these earthquakes hit Turkey and Syria makes me think that it's a good possibility now, or how Damascus will be a ruinous heap. What are your thoughts on that? Definite possibility. I believe it is, I'd have to look it up. I may be mixing two of those together, but I believe it says that Syria is destroyed and the whole event happens as a reaction because of what the children of Israel do. So that seems more like a war situation. But if it's a ruinous heap and then something happens, it's a definite possibility because earthquakes will do a lot of damage. And I do think it's interesting because we have a lot of prophecies about earthquakes. Jesus even said the earthquakes would be more and more frequent. And so pestilences, earthquakes, wars, those kind of things. But don't let your heart be troubled, because the end is not yet. Nation will arise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So we will see what happens on that. We definitely need to pray for Turkey and Syria at this point, all the people, and in the Ukraine, all the people that are without power, as throughout the winter and everything. It's just really bad. Okay, let's see here. Let me go to the next question. Did you see the recent Daily Mail UK article that reported on a premature puberty phenomenon in girls? Which Dead Sea Scroll is that prophecy in? I believe it's in the Ezra Apocalypse. Actually, I think it's in 2 or 3 of them. So it's in that one for sure, part of it. And it did say, actually, let me bring that up. I think I've got that. This is what I want, the reason why I want to do this kind of thing, so we can have it here. That's under, let me think. I should put that under Haggai, because it's a medical thing. It's not just a prophecy, but it's a medical thing. So, yeah, and right now under Haggai, we have this here, which is a history of the book of Haggai, which is the quotes from the, see, there's a link to the Testaments of the Patriarchs. And I need to do that differently. But some of the quotes, so we know that it exists and what it is. End time health prophecies. I haven't finished writing this yet, so it's not completely out. But lifespans continue to go down according to some of these prophecies. And again, we don't know exactly why, but the concept is that we used to live to be 900 pre-flood. After the flood, the first 4 or 5 generations only lived to be around 400. It's like it was cut in half, if you believe these texts. Well, and actually the Old Testament would give you that too. And then something seems to happen, and lifespan, we don't know what that was, but something seems to happen. There's theories, but it cuts the lifespan in half again. So now, best anybody would live would be 200. We see Abraham living to 175. And if you believe the Old Testament, as Christians do, you can see that coming down. And one of the things that's interesting is that, and this is speculation on my part, if you look at the pre-flood people, they get married and or start having kids like 130, 140, something like that, and they live to be 900. Well, if you assume everything is cut down to a tenth, then that would mean a boy and a girl around 13 could theoretically get pregnant and have a child, and they would only live to be 90 as opposed to 135 and 900. Don't know if that's the case or not, but it's interesting to think that maybe puberty was 130 way back then when they lived to be 900, and now it's 13-ish and 90-ish. So anyway, this continues. It talks about premature babies, but that might be just talking about how it is an art thing. So let me find that. There's a lot of stuff in here about that. And then stuff about end time diseases, which is really interesting because I think we're seeing some of that now. And yeah, Ezra Apocalypse has got some of them. Aging increases. And yeah, Ancient Apocalypse of Ezra is one place, and I know it's at least in 2 separate scrolls. But anyway, pregnant women. Well, this pregnant women. This one right here. This is Ezra Apocalypse 6:21. It says pregnant women will give birth prematurely at 3 and 4 months, and their babies will live and be raised up. And so there's other things connected with that. So when I first read this, I'm thinking just premature. Let me get out of this here. So premature, if you're looking at it the way we would look at it, you've got a gestation period that's still supposed to be 9 months. but medical science is able to take care of that earlier. It used to be, I remember when I was a kid, a 7-month-old baby is pretty safe. 6 month, no, there's no way it would survive. It's just not possible. Now we've got even 5-month-old babies, or 5.5, something like that. It's not a guaranteed deal by any means, but a good amount of them, if you're very careful, can live. But this says 3 and 4 months. And I'm assuming that 3 and 4 put together means a good 4 months, maybe 3 months and 28, 29 days, a little less than 4, but it has to be very close to 4. So I'm looking at that at 4. But with the aging decreases, because up here it talked about, and we'll have this out publicly eventually, but up here we talked about with the lifespans, it talks about all of that, and then it talks about how at the very end, lifespans will drop to be about 70. And if you live to be 75, that will be considered old age. And, looking at the rest of these, that's crazy. 100, 200, 300, So, um, yeah. Okay. So anyway, so that's the quote then. So that to answer your question, I ramble on too much. Ezra 6:21 is one of them, and we'll find the others and put it in there eventually also. So, all right, let me get to the next question. I think it's interesting because I had thought that the lifespan of the Essenes being 120 is partially genetics, and there's just flat no way we can do that. And come to find out, there's a few people groups on the planet today that still live around 110, maybe not quite 120-ish, but somewhere in there. What books do you recommend containing the accurate analysis of earthquakes in the end times near Turkey, Iran, and Israel? Today's earthquakes make me want to hear it taught. I don't have any direct information on that or any particular sources. I do know that some people try to tell you that the earthquakes are no different than they have been in the past, and you can manipulate the numbers like that. So if you're looking at earthquakes, say like 7.0 and 8.0 or greater, the really, really big ones may not be much more than they used to. Thank the Lord, because we'd all be dead. So you can look at numbers like that, or if you pick just the ones from 6 to 7 or something like that, you can make it look kind of like that. But if you take all of them in a whole, the little ones are getting more and more. Back in the 80s or 90s, they came up with a term called swarm earthquakes, which are when you get a whole lot of the aftershocks or pre-shocks that might be so low that most people don't even feel them, but they just kind of like keep going for a while, and that was never known before. So anyway, it's definitely increasing. Has everything that's been found of the Dead Sea Scrolls been translated into English? I believe so. Um, Actually, I take that back. Uh, the what they do is they look at caves, and if the cave doesn't have anything in them, it's just counted and it went on. So there's some 53, 54 caves now that have been looked at with a fine-tooth comb, most of which don't have anything in them, no writing of any kind. When they do find a writing, they call that a Dead Sea Scroll cave, and there's been 11 of those proper. And so when you go look up any of the Dead Sea Scroll text, you'll find up to cave 11. And so all of those have been translated into English. A lot of them are fragmented, so there's not a whole lot to them, but they have been, and you can get those. And we have a lot of those on our website. Cave 12 was about 2 years ago, and they did find writing. Number one, there was some words on pottery. That doesn't amount to a whole lot, but still it's technically writing. And they did find what they thought was blank paper. It was just badly faded. So they're supposed to be trying to use special scanning techniques to pull off the paper what was on it. So we do have more coming. And so other things pop up from time to time. So the most part is the first 11 caves. There's something interesting in cave 12. Hopefully they'll come out this year. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls include any of the fathers discussing being of the order of Melchizedek? Um, I don't think so directly like that. They'll mention the order and things like that, but to say like I'm of that order as opposed to this, I don't think there's any language like that. Their personal testimonies, especially thinking about Abraham and his experience. There's a lot in there that could be along those lines, but nothing directly saying something like I am the order of Melchizedek or anything like that. Um, as far as a person saying that, anyway. When it comes to other stuff, I mean, we've got 11Q13 that talks about the Melchizedekian order, the Melchizedek that comes to pay the penalty for our sin nature, that has an event that occurs in 32 AD, and he is actually God incarnate, but it calls him the Melchizedekian priest. So there's lots of things like that. And then they identify, kind of go back and forth, the Melchizedekian priest, the actual one that we all kind of serve and teach for. Is also called the teacher of righteousness, is also called the healer. Let's see, there's several things like the son of righteousness and things like that. So, okay, let's see here. Donation, $5 donation. Thank you very much. Again, every little bit helps. Thank you. When did the Jews start celebrating the New Year in the fall instead of the spring? Gad mentioned the New Year was as Tishrei 1, about 1000 BC. Wasn't spring still the New Year in 1000 BC? It should be, yeah. I'd have to look at that and see if the translation is good or not, or how that works. According to what everything was written, the way they talk about the calendar stuff, there may have been a couple of different calendars, which is what the Pharisees say, but the Essenes held hard that the religious things should always be on the spring calendar, spring equinox. So, according to them, the push to get rid of the spring equinox calendar, at least, was about 200 BC, or not 200, in the 200s BC, I should say. So that's you've got Antiochus Epiphanes, pushing really hard to get rid of Judaism totally, and then he ends up dying 165 to 162, somewhere in there. So there could be, it's an interesting thing. So I'm not sure. Probably what happens is that there's a start and a push to do something different, and two separate calendars for a while, and then the push to finally get rid of the other one. So good question. Do you have any books focused on explaining the book of Revelation? We have not just like a Revelation commentary, but we do have our book, Ancient Post-Flood, or no, Ancient Prophecies Revealed. Let me pull this up and see if we can find it here. We do it this way. And so here's our regular site, and on our bookstore, we have Ancient Prophecies Revealed. This one here would be the closest thing that we have to Revelation. But what we did on this one, rather than going through a specific book, if I can make that bigger or not. Yeah, there we go, a little bit. We start with we gap all the prophecies. So from creation to the Exodus, there's so many prophecies. Exodus to the rise of Babylon, Babylon to the Messiah, all about the Messiah's first coming, the dispersion, the Messiah to the dispersion, so that 100 years, the Great Dispersion, and then modern Israel, future events, apostasy of the church, rapture, tribulation, and millennial reign. So we try to take, there's over 500 prophecies, but we try to put them in the order of fulfillment. If they have been fulfilled, then we go ahead and put a date on approximately when the prophecy was given, and then and then the date of fulfillment. And so that goes good up to here anyway. And these, of course, are not fulfilled yet. But anyway, that would be a good thing to look at as far as prophecy goes, but nothing directly on Revelation. We need to do that. In the millennial kingdom, with the surviving mortals, will the surviving mortals know that believers are now immortal and have glorified bodies, or will we be like angels who generally don't reveal their identities? That's a good question. I would assume, according to the scrolls, that they would know, because there's one piece in the scroll that talks about what we call the Passover ritual. And the idea was that there was a Melchizedekian version pre-Moses. From Moses forward, there's what we know as the Passover Seder. And when Messiah comes the first time, it was supposed to change into a different ritual. And so we see that in Christian communion. But they mentioned that when the Messiah comes back to set up the kingdom, that ritual will change again and we'll have a kingdom celebration. And they speculated on what that might look like. And one of the things they said is that there would be Jews and Gentiles, immortals, angels, and the Messiah together taking communion. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if that would be true or not, but it just shows their concept of it. And so, with that in mind, then yeah, the angels would be around. Maybe not all the time, but immortals would be around. So, very, very interesting. Who are the 200 million horsemen in Revelation? Um, I'm not exactly sure. There's a couple different theories on it. Some people try to say that it's the armies of China. They could definitely have a 200 million man army. Um, but they also seem to be demonic, as you're talking about here. So that would make them non-human in that sense. So I'm not exactly sure. That's something we definitely want to try to find out sometime. What are your thoughts on the pregnant woman during the rapture? Some pastors believe only babies will go and not the unbelievers. Well, unbelievers are not raptured, and we do have this concept of the age of accountability. So I would assume young children, and you're a human child starting at conception. So yeah, I would think, and that would make it much more than just a few people disappearing. There'd be a lot of people, and basically all of the kids gone. That would definitely make people stop and take notice, I think. And that does kind of go along with the Lord's mercy. The kids haven't been able to accept Messiah yet. The kids haven't been able to understand anything yet. And they're not at that age of accountability where they probably couldn't make a decision like that. So in that case, the decision could be made for them. I think so. I mean, that's kind of what I've always thought. Can't prove it, but I think so. What website do you recommend for reading all the scroll fragments, even the small ones in English? English would be hard because the Israeli Antiquities Department has all of them in high res photos that you can go and look at. But of course, you'd have to read Paleo Hebrew nonetheless. But you can blow it up and read it, and it's really good. Um, I don't know that there is any one place like that. Um, There is, what I have is the, uh, it's a 40 volume collection called The Discoveries in the Judean Desert, and they occasionally add to it. So that's a place you can go to, but you would have to buy those books. And we probably have links to PDFs of those because they're studied a lot in different seminaries. So you might check our website to see if there's anything, links or PDFs for discoveries in the Judean Desert. And then there's also other things too, like there's the Dead Sea Scroll readers, and then study editions. So there's two or three of those put out by different people. Some of those are just one or two volumes that would have almost all of the scrolls. But I'm not sure that any one of those collections, no matter how you did it, would have every single one in there. That's what makes it hard. It's still difficult to get a hold of all of them. How do they determine the age of the Dead Sea Scrolls? First things, yeah, scoffer type people will say the first thing scoffer type people will say is that Christians like the Dead Sea Scrolls are after Christ and not before. Some of them might be first century AD. And I think, and this is basically just what the Israeli antiquities say. The concept is each century has a style of writing, words. There is carbon dating also, and sometimes that's legit, and sometimes it's not. It depends on the paper and what's messed it up. But what's interesting to me is when they have at least a handful of the scrolls and say this is obviously first or even second century BC when it's dated to that way on all of those fragments, the handwriting analysis, the radiocarbon dating, and then other things. That's what makes it interesting. Some of them can be, give or take because they're fragmented, messed up, not hard telling what is on them exactly. But yeah, that's one of the things we need to look at. But if we just go back to like the Israelis Antiquities site and go by what they date them as, I think it's pretty straightforward. Who are the people who uncover newly discovered Dead Sea Scrolls? Um, there are people that are professional archaeologists that are hired or usually volunteer to work with the Israeli Antiquities Department. It takes a lot of money, and I have no idea how much, but to actually put together, you want to dig a certain area, spend a summer doing it. Um, it's not so much even the equipment, but the people having to do it just right. You can't go too fast or you'll destroy scrolls if there's broken pottery and it's just setting out. You have to go, inch by inch, layer by layer, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of people. But they all have um, degrees in archaeology. So, for instance, on the teams, there actually might be atheists, Roman Catholics, Jews, Protestants, people that are secular, don't know, don't care. They just like old stuff. So, but they're all trained in how to do it so that they don't damage anything. They're all there and it's all recorded. So there's no way that someone would discover something and no ever, tamper with it. And in most cases, if they find something that's sealed, they don't even open it there. They package it up and send it off to um, a university who will probably open it up very carefully if they even open it up at all. Inside of like a room with special gases just to make sure the best possible way of preserving it. So there's actually a lot that goes through it, and I don't understand a whole lot of it. Randall Price is actually, for instance, a Christian who worked for Liberty University for a long time and spent a lot of summers over in Israel doing digs. He is one of the people that headed up the Cave 12, for instance. And so I have a few friends that were on that particular dig. But it's interesting just to kind of see that. how they're schooled in that way. So it's overseen by a lot of people, and then of course they do try to get a lot of people that are being archaeologists to come on board and do basically work for free as part of their dissertations, that kind of stuff, to try to keep the cost down. But pretty interesting. Okay. Super chat, $25 donation. Thank you very much. Could Abraham and Melchizedek meeting be a, okay, there we go, Christophany? A lot of people have thought so. According to some of the old text at that time, it wasn't just a Melchizedekian guy. It was an order of Melchizedek priests. We actually have a book on that. And these are our Dead Sea Scroll stuff that we did. Enoch and Jubilees, of course, are mainly Ethiopic, so may or may not be 100% accurate. But this one, Ancient Order of Melchizedek, we take you through all those old sources and then through the book of Hebrews, kind of pull them together to show the order versus the man. And so it seems like rather than a Christophany, it was just the Melchizedekian priest at the time. So many current prophecy teachers are adamant that on the soon return of Christ for his church, that's a rapture. I've never heard your ideas on this. How long do you think we have? I tend to think longer than some. I tend to too. Basically, the rapture is before the tribulation period, and it's not tied to anything. So, for instance, the tribulation period is only 7 years because the Lord comes back and stops it. Otherwise, it would probably go on for who knows how long. And so the 7-year tribulation period is directly connected to the second coming. So the second coming can't happen right now. It's at least 7 years away for, that kind of a thing. The rapture could be right at that point, which makes sense to me, or it could be a few months or even a few years before. There's some debate on that. I can't really prove it one way or the other. So with that in mind, though, there's nothing connected to the rapture like first we have to have this, then a rapture, other than Paul talking about the apostasy. And of course, that could mean several things. So I don't think there's a specific thing that we can identify, at least, that has to occur before the rapture. So I would technically believe in imminence. It could happen at any time. With that in mind, I don't think it's random. I think God knows exactly when it's going to happen, or at least the Father anyway. But yeah, I look at this stuff and the way I kind of put it together is we have some prophecies that are supposed to happen with Israel, like the war with Iran, the Psalm 83 war, if it's still, a future war, destruction of Damascus, that could be pretty quick. But some of these seem like it would take a while for it to happen. And if it's really quick, it still might be 5 or 10 years. Well, if it's 5 or 10 years and then it ends sometime in the tribulation period, then we don't have 7 years to wait. It's more like 10 or something like that. And so if you think like I do, the rapture might be right at the beginning of the 7-year period, or within a few months or something, then that would push it a few years off. But I don't know. It's just speculation. It's a good point. So I tend to think that one of the things that I'm thinking of too is the whole idea of the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. If the end of the age is 2075, that theoretically should be the second coming, minus 7 years, a rapture. Except it says, unless those days be shortened. So the only thing that I'm coming to mind for me is that the rapture could be any time between now and 2067. I really don't see a rapture being 100 or 200 years from now, so, but I don't necessarily see it in the next year or two. I would love to be wrong. Wouldn't it be fantastic if, we go to bed tonight and the Lord comes or comes tomorrow? But anyway, yeah, that's my basic idea too. So, okay, we will go ahead and stop there for tonight. And next week we'll come back and continue our studies on this. I want to kind of switch over, and we'll come back to this occasionally when we find more books or scrolls or something. Continue the discussion, the lists, all those lists. But I want to shift over to what the early church fathers talked about the prophecies and go back into looking at pulling these together. So if we can pull together everything we have from the scrolls and everything from the church fathers, and then re-look at the prophecies, Daniel and Revelation and those things, we're liable to figure something out. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say good night then. God bless you guys, and we will see you next week.